I was 16 the first time I camped alone. I'd been on plenty of trips with my family before, up to our property in northern Michigan, but this was different. This time, it was just me and our dog, Duke. Duke was a Chow and Black Lab mix, built like a small bear, thick fur, broad chest, strong legs. He was the kind of dog people crossed the street to avoid, but in reality, he was mild-mannered, almost lazy. Nothing ever seemed to bother him. He'd nap through thunderstorms, barely lift his head when strangers came by, and let little kids crawl all over him without a fuss. He wasn't a watchdog, at least not in the way you'd expect a big dog to be. He was just there. Solid, dependable, a quiet presence. That's why what happened on the second night out there scared the hell out of me. The property was about 40 acres of dense northern woods, pine, oak, thick underbrush, and no clear trails. There was an old logging road that cut through it, mostly overgrown, but still drivable with a high-clearance vehicle. I had taken my dad's truck as far in as I could go before unloading my gear and hiking the rest of the way to a small clearing we always used for camping. It was nothing special, just a flat spot with an old fire ring made of rocks and some logs arranged around it. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough for some wind cover, but not so close that branches would scrape against the nylon. Duke wandered around, sniffing at things, tail wagging lazily. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, and there was the constant background noise of insects and birds. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only get when you're far away from everything. By late afternoon, I had everything set up, tent staked down, firewood gathered, food stored in a cooler a safe distance from camp. I sat by the fire, ate a sandwich, and watched the sunset bleed orange and purple through the trees. Duke lay beside me, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air before settling back down. When darkness set in, the forest came alive in a different way. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. I wasn't scared, at least not yet. I grew up in these woods. I knew what was out here. Deer, raccoons, maybe the occasional black bear, but nothing that would come looking for trouble. That first night passed without incident. I zipped into my sleeping bag, Duke curled up near my feet, and I slept soundly. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning hiking around, marking trails with bits of cloth so I wouldn't get turned around. Duke trotted beside me, panting happily. In the afternoon, I fished at a small stream on the edge of the property, cooked up what I caught, and let the rest of the day pass in easy silence. As night fell, I banked the fire and crawled into the tent. Duke followed, circling twice before flopping down near the entrance. I was half asleep when I noticed he was restless. He kept shifting, lifting his head, ears twitching. His tail thumped against the ground a few times before he went still. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because when I woke up, everything was different. Duke was standing. Not just standing, he was rigid, ears pinned back, body tense. His teeth were bared, and the lowest, deepest growl I'd ever heard was rolling out of him. So deep I could feel the vibration in my chest. I froze. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling the tent. Not the quick, light steps of a deer, not the rustling, chaotic movement of a raccoon. These were slow, steady, unmistakably human. Duke tracked the sound, turning his head in a slow, controlled movement, his growl never stopping. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I reached out, fumbling blindly for my flashlight. My fingers closed around it, but I didn't dare turn it on. Something exhaled just outside the tent. A sharp, heavy breath. Not an animal. Not something small. I held my breath. Duke's growl stayed constant, his body shifting slightly as he followed whatever it was moving outside. He did a full rotation, nose up, hackles bristling, muscles bunched. Then he stopped. His entire body locked onto the tent flap. Whatever was out there was standing right in front of it. I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I wanted to turn it on, to do something, but fear kept me frozen. The breathing was closer now. Deep, steady. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Duke stayed locked in position, but the growl slowly faded. Minutes passed. I couldn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Duke sat down. He didn't relax completely. His ears stayed up, his eyes never left the entrance, but the tension in his body lessened slightly. Whatever had been outside was gone. But we didn't sleep. I sat there with Duke, staring at the entrance, my heart still hammering. Every small sound made my skin crawl. The wind rustled the trees. A branch cracked somewhere in the distance, but there were no more footsteps. As soon as the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, I moved. I packed up camp in record time, shoving everything into my bag without care. Duke stayed close, still on edge, eyes darting around. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The hike back to the truck was the longest of my life. Every noise made me flinch. Duke stayed ahead of me, ears swiveling, posture tense. It wasn't until we reached the truck that he finally shook himself out, let out a huge breath, and wagged his tail. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't know what was out there that night. A person, maybe. Some drifter passing through, or someone who didn't want to be seen. But it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. Duke never reacted like that to anything before or after that night. I never camped alone there again. I had been camping alone for years. It wasn't something I thought twice about. Remote spots, places deep in the backcountry where I wouldn't see another soul for days, that was my usual preference. This place, compared to some of the places I'd been, wasn't even that far out. A few hours from the city, a free camping spot along a river, complete with a fire pit and a beat-up old picnic table. It was the kind of spot locals probably used during the summer, but in the fall, with the cold creeping in and the days getting shorter, it was empty. That was why I picked it. The drive-in was uneventful. A long stretch of highway, then onto gravel roads, weaving deeper into the forest. The further I drove, the quieter it got. The usual signs of civilization, houses, fences, power lines, disappeared. The only thing left was endless trees, the occasional glimpse of the river, and the crunch of gravel under my tires. By the time I reached the site, the sun was already lowering behind the tree line. The spot was as expected, flat ground, the fire pit made from large stones, and the picnic table, weathered and cracked from years of exposure. The river ran just a short distance away, its surface calm, reflecting the colors of the trees that lined the banks. It was quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind and the distant sound of the water moving over rocks. I got to work setting up camp. Tent first, staked down tightly in case the wind picked up. Sleeping bag unrolled, gear organized. I set up my cooking stove on the picnic table, made a quick meal, and sat there eating while the last bit of daylight faded. It should have been relaxing, but it wasn't. I've spent enough nights alone in the woods to know the difference between normal quiet and something else. This was something else. I wasn't hearing anything strange, no snapping twigs, no movement in the underbrush, but something felt off. A kind of pressure in the air, a stillness that didn't feel right. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. At first, I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my brain reacting to the isolation, the way it sometimes does when you spend too much time alone in the woods. I kept telling myself that, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the tree line, listening for something, anything, that might explain why I was on edge. But there was nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional sound of the river shifting against the rocks. I finished eating, put out the fire, and decided to turn in early. The feeling didn't go away inside the tent. If anything, it got worse. The thin walls of nylon felt useless, like they weren't enough to keep whatever was out there away from me. I wasn't tired, but I forced myself to lay down, zipped into my sleeping bag, and turned on a podcast on my speaker. Something familiar, a voice to fill the silence. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember waking up. The first thing I noticed was the cold. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the air inside the tent was crisp. The second thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. The uneasy feeling from the night before was gone, but in its place was something else. A kind of awareness, a feeling that something had changed. I unzipped the tent and crawled out. The sun was barely over the horizon, the light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The river was calm, a thin layer of mist hovering over the surface. Everything looked normal, until I turned toward the picnic table. That's when I saw it. A hat, sitting on the table, right in the middle of the wooden planks. It wasn't mine. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there the day before. I had set my stove on that table, had sat there eating dinner, had gone through my gear. If that hat had been there, I would have seen it. But now here it was. A worn baseball cap, dark in color, the fabric faded and creased from use. I stared at it for a long time, my brain trying to make sense of it. There were only a few possibilities. Someone had been in my camp during the night. that someone had left the hat there. I had slept through all of it. I looked around, scanning the ground for footprints, any sign that someone had walked through my camp. The dirt was disturbed, but that didn't mean much. The wind, the way the light played with the shadows, it was hard to tell if anything was different. I didn't touch the hat. I didn't want to. The thought of someone being that close to me, while I slept, made my stomach turn. I started packing up immediately. I didn't bother making coffee, didn't bother eating. I moved quickly, stuffing gear into my pack, breaking down the tent, securing everything in the truck. Every few minutes, I looked up, scanning the trees, checking the shadows. I still didn't hear anything. When I was finally ready to leave, I hesitated. I looked at the hat one last time. Then I got in my truck and drove away. I've gone over that night in my head more times than I can count. The feeling I had, the uneasy, creeping sensation that I was being watched, I don't think it was in my head. I think someone was there. A hunter, a hiker, a mushroom picker maybe. Someone moving through the woods, maybe looking for a place to sleep, maybe just passing through. But that doesn't explain why they left the hat. It wasn't dropped. It was placed, right in the center of the table, where I would see it. I don't know why, and I don't want to. I've camped alone since then, plenty of times, but I've never gone back to that spot. The whole idea to go camping that night wasn't really planned. It was one of those last-minute decisions that didn't make a lot of sense, but we went through with it anyway. My dad, my sister, and I had been talking about getting out into the woods for a while, and I guess that night, something made my dad decide it was finally time. The problem was it had rained all day, non-stop, and the ground was completely soaked. On top of that, we didn't even leave the house until it was already getting dark. By the time we drove out to the spot, it was pitch black. The only light we had was from the car's headlights and our flashlights, which barely did anything in the thick woods. The rain had stopped, but everything was dripping wet, and the air was heavy and damp. The kind of damp that clings to your clothes and makes everything feel colder than it actually is. I remember stepping out of the car and immediately feeling weird. It wasn't like I thought something was out there watching us. Not exactly, but there was just this unsettling feeling that made me keep looking over my shoulder. The sound of water dripping from the trees filled the air, along with the occasional rustling from something moving through the wet underbrush. Probably just small animals, but in the dark, every sound felt amplified. Setting up the tent was a nightmare. The ground was soft and muddy, and every time we tried to push a stake in, it either slid right back out or got stuck in a tangle of roots. We fumbled around for what felt like forever, struggling with the poles and the rain-soaked fabric. The air smelled like wet leaves and damp earth, and every few minutes, a gust of wind would shake the trees, making them drop more cold water down on us. Eventually, we got the tent up, though it wasn't great. The ground underneath was lumpy and wet, and the inside of the tent felt damp just from all the moisture in the air. But we were tired, and at that point, it didn't really matter. We crawled inside, zipped up the door, and settled in for the night. I laid down in my sleeping bag, but I couldn't relax. That weird feeling was still nagging at me, like an itch in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. I kept listening to the woods outside, hearing the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of something moving in the distance. My dad and my sister seemed fine, though. My dad was already breathing slow and steady, like he was dozing off, and my sister wasn't saying anything either. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that the sounds I was hearing were normal forest noises. But as I lay there, half awake, half asleep, I swore I heard footsteps. Not just rustling in the underbrush, but actual, deliberate steps. Slow, heavy, moving somewhere nearby. I wanted to sit up, but my body felt weighed down by exhaustion. My eyelids kept drooping, and my brain kept slipping in and out of consciousness. The last thing I remember before I fully started drifting off was hearing those faint, steady steps, like something was walking just beyond the tent. Then suddenly my dad shot upright. It was so fast, so sudden, it startled me awake. The way he sat up wasn't normal. It was like something out of a horror movie, like his body had just snapped up on its own. My heart jumped, and I turned my head slowly to look at him, confused, still groggy from sleep. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps. Right outside the tent. Close. And then the low, guttural sound of something grunting. I felt a jolt of fear, so strong it made my whole body tense up. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I couldn't move. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing, But the only thought that kept repeating in my head was, something is out there. Right outside. Something big. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was deathly silent. The kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, making every tiny noise seem deafening. Then my dad yelled, "Get out of here!" His voice was loud, commanding, full of authority and fear at the same time. The kind of yell that was meant to scare something off. But instead of running, whatever was outside made a sound that sent pure terror through me. A deep, throaty growl. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close to human. It was low and rumbling, filled with something that sounded more like anger than fear. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the entire side of the tent caved in. Something huge had hit it. Hard. I heard fabric tearing. The whole tent shook violently, and for a second, I thought it was going to collapse on top of us. I could hear the sound of something massive shifting outside, the crunch of leaves, and the heavy exhale of an animal breathing. I didn't even breathe. None of us did. We just sat there, frozen, too scared to make a sound, too scared to even move. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then another. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, so loud it drowned out everything else. My dad hadn't moved since he yelled, and my sister was completely still, probably holding her breath just like I was. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard it moving away. Slow, heavy footsteps retreating into the darkness, fading into the distance. We waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Maybe more. No one wanted to unzip the tent to see what was on the other side. Eventually, my dad moved first. He slowly reached out, unzipped the door just a crack, and peered outside with the flashlight. I could see his hand shaking as he held it up, scanning the area. The ground was torn up. Mud was disturbed, leaves scattered. The side of the tent where it had been hit had deep gashes in the fabric, long slashes where something had ripped through it. We didn't sleep after that. None of us did. We sat there in silence for the rest of the night, listening, waiting, afraid that whatever it was might come back. At first light, we packed up everything as fast as we could. We barely talked. My dad kept looking around, scanning the trees, checking the ground for tracks. When we finally got back to the car, I remember looking back at the tent one last time, seeing those torn up holes in the fabric, proof that it really happened. And even though we were safe, even though we were getting out of there, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that whole night. I don't know why I walked into the woods alone that night. Looking back, it was stupid. But at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was a scout event, one of the biggest I'd been to, with at least 1,000 people spread across the campsite. Fires dotted the clearing, tents packed tightly together in neat rows, and the sound of laughter and conversation carried through the trees. It should have felt safe. But it was Belanglo. The name itself carried weight. Everyone knew what had happened there. The backpacker murders. 7 bodies dumped in the forest, left to decay among the trees. Some of them had been there for years before they were found. People talked about it in hushed voices around the campfires, their faces lit by the flickering glow. Some laughed it off, made jokes. Others stayed quiet, listening. I didn't think about any of that when I stepped away from the group that night. I just had to pee. The toilets were busy, a long queue of people waiting, shifting from foot to foot, talking quietly under the cold night sky. I didn't feel like standing there. It was late, I was tired, and the woods were right there. Just a few steps away. No big deal. So I walked in. The air changed the second I left the clearing. The noise of the camp faded behind me, muffled by the thick trunks of the pine trees. The ground was soft, damp from the recent rain, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose. I took a few more steps, far enough that no one would see me, then stopped. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The moment I unzipped my pants, I felt it. That creeping sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just darkness stretching out in all directions, broken only by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the branches. I took a breath, shook off the nerves. It was just my imagination. I had to be thinking about the murders, the stories, the fear that clung to this place. That was all. Then I looked down. The first thing I saw was white. Small, jagged pieces scattered across the damp earth. More than just a few. Dozens. No, hundreds. Bones. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze. For 5 long seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't think. My brain refused to process what I was looking at. They were everywhere, sticking up through the moss, half buried in the dirt. Some long and straight, others twisted and broken. I could see ribs, vertebrae, something that looked like a jawbone. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. Human. The word slammed into my brain like a hammer. I was standing in the middle of a field of bones. Alone. In Belanglo. I forced my eyes to focus, to really see. The shapes, the textures. The way the bones were scattered, random, careless. My breath came fast and shallow, heart pounding against my ribs. Then something shifted. A small detail, but enough to crack through the fear. They weren't human. I exhaled, a shuddering, uneven breath. My hands were shaking. I blinked, trying to slow my heartbeat, trying to make sense of it. Animal bones. I could see it now. The shape of a skull, too long and narrow. The size of the leg bones, too small. Some kind of deer, maybe. Wild dogs. Something not human. My knees nearly gave out. It was fine. It was fine. I had scared myself for nothing. The tension in my chest loosened, but only slightly. My mind was still racing, my body still wired with adrenaline, because the fear didn't really go away. It wasn't the bones that scared me anymore. It was the fact that they were there. Someone, or something, had brought them here. Left them in this spot. Scattered them like this. I swallowed, my throat dry. The trees pressed in around me, the silence heavier than before. I wasn't supposed to be here. Slowly, I took a step back. Then another. Careful not to disturb anything, not to make a sound. My body was screaming at me to run, to turn and bolt back to the camp, but I forced myself to move slow, deliberate. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. My breath came fast, too loud in the quiet. I took another step, and a branch snapped somewhere behind me. The sound was sharp, crisp, like a gunshot in the stillness. I stopped breathing. For a long, terrible moment, I just stood there. Then, carefully, I turned my head. Nothing but darkness. The trees stood still, unmoving. The wind had died down. But I knew. Someone else was out there. I could feel them. They weren't moving, not yet. Just waiting. Watching. My pulse hammered in my ears. My mouth was dry. I had to get out of there. I forced my legs to move. Steady steps, slow, trying not to make noise, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. Step, step, step. Another crunch behind me. Closer. My stomach twisted. My breath hitched. I moved faster. I could see the faint glow of the camp through the trees now. Distant but close enough. Almost there. Another step. And then, something moved. Not just a sound this time. A shape. A shadow shifting between the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. I ran. Bolted for the camp, crashing through the underbrush, feet slipping in the damp earth. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, my breath ragged and uneven. The light got closer. The voices, the fires. I broke through the tree line, stumbled into the open, gasping for air. The noise of the camp surrounded me, normal, safe. People laughing, talking, completely unaware. I turned back to the woods. The darkness stared back. Nothing moved. No sound. No sign of anyone there. But I knew what I had felt. I stood there for a long time, breathing hard, heart still racing. Then slowly, I walked back to my tent. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, but I didn't sleep that night. Camping alone in the backwoods of southern Mississippi wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done, but it was something I had wanted to do for a long time. I had always loved the woods, the solitude, the feeling of being completely removed from the rest of the world. The thick forests, the humid air, the smell of damp earth, it all felt like a reset from the noise of everyday life. I had chosen a spot far off any well-marked trails, a clearing near a slow-moving bayou. It was deep in gator country, but I figured if I was careful and stayed aware, I'd be fine. The water was dark, full of floating debris, and thick with the smell of rotting vegetation. Cypress trees loomed over it, their roots twisting up from the muck like skeletal fingers. Spanish moss hung heavy from their branches, barely swaying in the still, oppressive air. I had arrived late in the afternoon, set up my small one-person tent in the middle of the clearing, and built a fire. The woods were alive with sound. The distant croaks of bullfrogs, the occasional splash of something moving in the water, the high-pitched chirps of insects that never seemed to stop. I made a simple meal over the fire, ate quickly, and sat back against a fallen log, watching the flames flicker and listening to the night around me. At some point, exhaustion took over. The heat and humidity made everything feel sluggish, and with nothing else to do, I decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap shut, and laid back on my sleeping pad. The air inside was stifling, but I was too tired to care. I must have drifted off quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound that sent ice through my veins. A low, rumbling growl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Deep guttural, something alive and massive. It vibrated through the air, steady and relentless. I stayed completely still, my heartbeat slamming in my chest. It didn't stop. The growl rolled on, deep and primal, like the sound of something barely holding back a much more violent noise. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a bear. It was something heavier, something ancient. The woods felt different now, charged with an energy I hadn't noticed before. The frogs had gone silent. The insects had stopped. The only sound in the night was that long, steady growl. I stayed frozen, my body refusing to move. I could feel sweat dripping down my back, pooling in the fabric of my sleeping bag. My breathing was shallow, barely there. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay still, to not make a sound, to let whatever was out there pass. But the growl didn't pass. It stayed constant and unwavering, vibrating through the ground beneath me. Finally, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to move. Slowly, painfully slowly, I reached toward the zipper of my tent. I barely touched it, moving it just enough to create the smallest opening. I pressed my eye against the gap and peered outside. I almost wished I hadn't. In the center of my campsite, bathed in the dim glow of the dying fire, were two enormous alligators. And they were mating. I had seen gators before. I had watched them from a safe distance, sunning themselves on riverbanks, gliding through the water with barely a ripple. But I had never seen them like this. The male was massive, his dark, armored body nearly the length of my tent. His head was broad, his mouth slightly open, revealing rows of yellowed, jagged teeth. His tail flexed, sending dirt and pine needles scattering. His growl hadn't stopped. It was coming from deep in his throat, vibrating his entire body. The female was slightly smaller, her scales glistening in the firelight, her own low growls mixing with his. They were tangled together in the dirt, rolling, tails lashing, bodies slamming against the ground. The sound of their scales scraping together was sickening, like stone grinding against stone. Their bodies shifted, jaws snapping, growls deepening. The male's growl would rise in pitch, then drop back down, the vibration of it rattling in my chest even from inside the tent. I was trapped. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. If they rolled the wrong way, they could crush my tent without even realizing it. If they got spooked, if they became aggressive, there was nothing between me and them but a thin layer of nylon and air. I had never felt fear like this before. It wasn't just the fear of an immediate threat. It was the helplessness of knowing there was absolutely nothing I could do. If they turned on me, if they decided I was in the way, it would be over before I could even think about reacting. I laid there for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing, every muscle locked in place. I could hear the deep huff of their breathing, the scrape of their claws against the dirt. The male's tail slapped the ground so hard it sent a shockwave through the earth beneath me. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The male lifted his head, his throat still vibrating with that low, rolling growl. He turned slightly, his dark eyes scanning the clearing, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, his gaze locked onto my tent. I stopped breathing. He was staring directly at me. I could see the firelight reflecting in his eyes, the faint shimmer of movement behind those black, ancient pupils. He exhaled a slow, heavy breath that sent a ripple through his throat. I felt my fingers clench into fists, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to move. And then, just as slowly, he turned away. With a final, throaty rumble, he shifted his massive body and started toward the bayou. The female followed, moving with a slow, deliberate crawl, her tail sweeping a path through the dirt. They moved as if nothing had happened, as if they had never been there at all. I waited until the sounds of the swamp came back, the distant croaks of frogs, the buzz of insects, before I allowed myself to move. My arms were trembling as I unzipped the tent fully and sat up, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. My body felt numb, stiff with fear. I looked around the clearing. The dirt was churned up, the remnants of their struggle marked in deep grooves and scattered leaves. The fire had almost completely died out, casting only the faintest orange glow over the disturbed ground. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, back pressed against the fabric, gripping my knife even though I knew it would have been useless against something that size. Every tiny sound made my heart jump. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed my gear in record time, stuffing everything into my backpack without caring if it was neat. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just moved, my legs carrying me as fast as they could through the trees, back toward my truck, away from whatever had unfolded in that clearing the night before. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were still shaking. I threw my gear into the back, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, my face pale, my eyes wide. Eventually, I started the engine and pulled away, leaving the campsite behind. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. I had spent years planning this trip, a solo bicycle journey across the western United States, spanning roughly 5,300 miles over 7 months. The idea of riding through vast, open landscapes, sleeping under the stars, and waking up to the sounds of nature had always called to me. I wanted to disconnect from the noise of daily life and embrace the raw beauty of the wilderness. Unlike most long-distance cyclists, I wasn't interested in staying at campgrounds or motels along the way. My plan was simple: wild camping. Each night, I would find a secluded patch of land far from any road or town, pitch my tent, and drift off to sleep surrounded by nature. It was an approach that saved money, but more importantly, it made me feel like I was truly out there, alone, self-reliant, and free. The first few weeks went exactly as I had hoped. I cycled through endless plains, dense forests, and quiet mountain roads. The days were grueling, with miles of pedaling under the hot sun, but the nights were peaceful. I quickly fell into a rhythm: ride, eat, set up camp, and sleep. The sounds of crickets, owls, and rustling leaves became familiar, even comforting. But that changed one night in western Montana. I had been riding all day through a remote stretch of forest, where the road was barely more than a dirt path winding between towering pines. As the sun dipped low, I knew I needed to find a place to camp. I spotted a small clearing just off the road, nestled between the trees. A narrow stream trickled nearby, its sound soft and steady. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal on my small stove, and stretched out to rest. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the darkening sky, I noticed something. Silence. Not the usual quiet of the wilderness, but a total, unnatural absence of sound. No crickets. No wind. No rustling branches. I sat up, suddenly alert. My breath was the only thing I could hear. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a twig snapped. I froze. I knew what twigs sounded like when a squirrel or rabbit moved through the underbrush. Light, rapid, almost insignificant. But this sound was different. It was sharp, deliberate, heavy. Someone or something was out there. I reached for my flashlight, slowly unzipping the tent. As I shone the beam into the trees, nothing moved. The forest stood still, like a frozen photograph. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the exhaustion from the day had made me paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed awake for hours, listening. The silence never broke. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave that place behind. As I rode away, a strange sense of relief washed over me, like I had just escaped something I couldn't explain. I pushed hard that day, covering nearly 80 miles before stopping for the night. I found a new campsite deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization. The silence from the previous night still lingered in my mind, but I forced myself to believe it was nothing. That evening, as I sat near my tent eating dinner, I saw him. A man, standing in the trees about 50 yards away. He wasn't moving, just standing there, partially hidden behind a trunk. Watching me, a wave of cold fear ran through me. I wanted to call out, to demand to know what he was doing out here, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I stared back, gripping my knife with white-knuckled fingers. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. A month later, I had made my way into southern Washington. The days were getting shorter, the air cooler. The exhaustion of the journey was catching up to me, but I pushed on. Then one night I got sick. It started with a stomachache, then nausea. Within hours, I was vomiting violently outside my tent, my body racked with chills. I knew dehydration was a real danger. I had enough water for another day or two, but I was weak. The nearest town was 30 miles away. Under normal conditions, I could ride there in a few hours. But now, it felt impossible. As I lay in my tent, curled up in misery, I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then the fabric moved. Something, or someone, was touching the side of my tent, pressing against it as if testing the material. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure vanished. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening, waiting for whatever was out there to come back. By morning, I knew I had to leave. Weak and dizzy, I forced myself to pack up my gear. My legs trembled as I climbed onto my bike, every push of the pedals a struggle. I had barely made it a mile when I saw him. The same man, standing at the edge of the road, watching me pass. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pedaled harder, pushing my exhausted body to the limit. I rode for hours, only stopping when I reached the safety of a small motel on the outskirts of town. That night, I locked my door and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I never wild camped again. I finished my journey months later, reaching my final destination in California. But something had changed in me. I had always loved the silence of nature, the stillness, the solitude. But now I feared it, because I knew, somewhere in the deep, empty woods of the American West, something was out there, watching, waiting, and it had let me go. This time. I've been hunting in northern Minnesota since I was a teenager. My father taught me how to track deer, read the wind, and respect the woods. He always told me that the forest holds secrets, things you might not understand, things you don't want to stumble upon. I never truly grasped what he meant until the day I found the body. It was late October, that perfect time of year when the air is crisp, the leaves are mostly down, and the deer start moving more as they prepare for winter. I had planned this trip for weeks. Work had been draining me, and I needed the solitude. Just me, my rifle, and the stillness of the woods. I woke before dawn, brewed a quick pot of coffee on my propane stove, and double-checked my gear. The cabin I stayed in was an old hunting shack deep in the forest, about 2 miles from the nearest road. Isolated, but that's the way I liked it. The nearest town was 30 miles away. By 5:30 a.m., I was hiking to my usual stand, a sturdy wooden platform built between 2 thick oaks near a well-worn deer trail. The stars were still out, and my breath came in soft clouds in the cold morning air. The forest was alive with sound, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. I reached my stand and climbed up, settling in for the long wait. The forest slowly woke around me as the sky brightened. Birds called, squirrels chattered, and I listened intently for the rustle of a deer moving through the trees. But the woods were too quiet. Hours passed. Not a single sign of movement. No deer. No small game. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By noon, my stomach was growling, so I decided to stretch my legs. Sometimes a slow walk can stir something up, a deer bedded down, a fresh set of tracks. I climbed down and moved carefully, rifle slung over my shoulder, keeping my steps light. That's when I smelled it. It started as a faint odor, something barely noticeable beneath the crisp autumn air. At first, I thought it was just the scent of damp earth, maybe an old carcass left behind by coyotes. But as I walked, the smell grew stronger. It was the unmistakable stench of death. I've smelled dead animals before. Deer that had been gutted and left too long, raccoons rotting in the heat. This was different. It was heavier, thicker, almost sweet in the worst possible way. A deep unease settled in my gut, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved toward the smell, rifle ready, every sense on high alert. The forest felt wrong, the silence oppressive. Then I saw it, a disturbed patch of earth beneath a thick stand of pine trees. The ground looked like it had been recently dug up and then hastily covered again. Flies buzzed frantically above the soil, a black cloud of wings and movement. And then I saw what had been exposed. A hand, pale, bloated, fingers curled slightly as if in a final grasp. The skin was tinged with blue and purple, the nails cracked and dirt-stained. My stomach lurched. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. My mind raced. Had someone been buried here? How long ago? And most disturbing of all, who had done it? Then a sound. A branch snapping. Close. Too close. I wasn't alone. A chill crawled up my spine, every hair on my body standing on end. My fingers tightened on my rifle as I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. The smell of death was suffocating now, thick and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. Then another. The forest remained silent. I forced myself to move carefully, not wanting to draw attention. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then I heard it again. A crunch. A shuffle. Someone was there. I couldn't see them, but they were there, hiding in the trees, watching me. I turned and started walking, keeping my pace steady. Not running. Running would make me a target. Running would make them chase me. The scent of death clung to my clothes, the taste of it thick in my mouth. I could feel eyes on me the entire way back to my stand. My hands were shaking as I climbed the ladder, heart hammering against my ribs. I forced myself to sit, rifle in my lap, scanning the woods below. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then two. Nothing. The forest remained unnervingly still. I should have left. I should have packed up, hiked back to my cabin, and driven straight to the sheriff's office. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid. That maybe it was an old grave, something from years ago. Maybe an accident. Maybe just some hunter who got lost and never made it out. But deep down, I knew better. When the sun began to set, I climbed down, moving quickly. The hike back to my cabin felt longer than usual. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow stretched too long. I reached my cabin, bolted the door, and sat in silence, gripping my rifle. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something outside. A soft crunch of leaves. A faint breath against the window. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to be stupid. I packed up my gear and started the long hike back to my truck. I would report what I found, let the authorities handle it. But when I reached my stand, I froze. The ground beneath the trees, the disturbed patch of earth where I had seen the hand, was untouched. The flies were gone. The smell of death had vanished. The soil looked undisturbed, as if no one had ever been buried there. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had smelled. But it was gone. And then, just as I was about to turn away, a sound, a whisper, low, barely audible, drifting through the trees. Leave. I ran. I didn't care about noise. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the nearest town, to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. They searched. Sent a team out. They found nothing. No grave. No body. No tracks. Nothing. The sheriff gave me a long, unreadable look and told me to stay out of the woods for a while. Said sometimes the forest plays tricks on people. I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. And I know that someone was out there, watching. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. But sometimes late at night, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that terrible, rotting scent. And I know, someone is still out there, waiting, watching, hiding in the trees. I've never been the type to scare easily. I've spent countless nights alone in the woods, camping, hunting, just enjoying the solitude. Something about being surrounded by nature, away from the endless hum of civilization, has always been calming to me. But what happened that night at my uncle's cabin changed the way I see the woods. It was the summer of last year, late July. My uncle owns a small, off-grid cabin in West Virginia, tucked deep into the Monongahela National Forest. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a hand-pumped well, and a lantern-lit porch. I'd been up there plenty of times before, sometimes with family, sometimes alone. This trip, I was alone. I had driven in that morning, parked at the edge of the rough dirt trail leading up to the cabin, and hiked the last half-mile in. It was humid, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but the cabin was cool inside, shaded by a thick canopy of trees. I spent most of the day gathering firewood, setting up my gear, and making sure everything was in order. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some beans over the fire, sat on the porch with a beer, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Then the second night came. I woke up late that morning, feeling well-rested. The day was uneventful. I fished for a bit in the creek down the hill, cooked a simple dinner, and watched the sun dip below the trees. As darkness fell, I noticed something strange. Fog. It rolled in quickly, far faster than I had ever seen before. One moment, the woods were clear, and the next, thick tendrils of mist were snaking through the trees, creeping up the hillside, swallowing the path back toward my truck. Within minutes, the visibility had dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see 10 feet beyond the porch. I told myself it was normal. Fog happens, especially in the mountains. The air had been humid, and the temperature was dropping. Simple science. But the way it moved unsettled me. It didn't drift like normal fog. It pulsed, shifting in slow waves, as if something were pushing it forward from deep within the trees. The sounds of the forest faded with it. The crickets stopped chirping. The usual rustling in the underbrush went silent. Even the distant hoots of the owls ceased. A heavy stillness settled over the woods. I told myself it was nothing. I wasn't a child, afraid of the dark. I went inside, bolted the door, and settled into my sleeping bag on the old wooden cot. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the sheer, suffocating silence pressing in from outside. But I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my eyes. The lantern had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The fog outside was thicker than before, pressing right up against the cabin like a living thing. I sat up, listening, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. My first thought was that it had to be a bear. Black bears were common in this part of West Virginia, and though they usually avoided humans, a curious one might come sniffing around. Then I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Not a bear. A person. I moved silently, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and reached for my rifle. It was propped against the wall near the door. I took slow, steady breaths, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I waited. Then, through the small window beside the door, I saw him. A tall figure, just beyond the porch steps, standing perfectly still in the thick fog. I couldn't make out his face, just the silhouette. He was wearing dark clothing, his posture unnaturally rigid. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. Just standing there, watching. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I've dealt with trespassers before. Occasionally, hikers wandered too far off the marked trails, and sometimes, poachers showed up in the area. But something about this man felt wrong. I raised the rifle, not aiming directly at him yet, but ready. Who's there? Silence. Hey, I called louder this time. You're on private property. You need to leave. Nothing. He just stood there, motionless. A long moment passed. Then, without a sound, he stepped back into the fog. One step, then another, and then he was gone. The fog swallowed him whole. I didn't move for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any sound, any hint of movement in the trees. Nothing. The silence was complete. The fog was so thick outside that even the dim glow of the moon couldn't penetrate it. I locked every window, bolted the door, and kept my rifle close. Sleep was out of the question. At some point in the night, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, something lighter. A tap. A single, deliberate tap against the window. My throat went dry. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. The window was completely fogged over from the outside. But there, right in the center, was the unmistakable impression of a handprint. A human hand, pressed against the glass. I stayed frozen, my grip on the rifle tightening. My breathing was shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. After what felt like an eternity, the handprint faded, vanishing back into the fog. But I knew he was still out there, watching. I don't remember falling asleep. But at some point, exhaustion must have won out because I jolted awake to the sound of birds chirping. Sunlight streamed through the window. The fog was gone. I hesitated before unbolting the door, rifle still in hand. The ground outside was damp, the dirt soft. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Then I looked down. Boot prints, leading from the trees to the porch, circling the cabin, stopping at the window. But there were no prints leading away. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there had disappeared without a trace. I packed up and left that morning, hiking back to my truck with my rifle in hand, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched. I told my uncle what happened. He just nodded, like he had heard something similar before. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. I don't usually hike alone, but that day, I needed to clear my head. Work had been a nightmare. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with emails, and I just wanted to be somewhere quiet. So I packed my bag, drove out to the Olympic National Forest, and started hiking a lesser-known trail I'd heard about from a coworker. It wasn't an official route, but it was supposed to be beautiful: thick evergreens, soft moss-covered ground, and barely a soul in sight. Perfect. I had the whole day ahead of me, so I took my time, breathing in the clean air and listening to the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. The weather was ideal, cool, cloudy, the kind of day where the mist settles between the trees like something out of a dream. After about 2 hours of hiking, the trail narrowed, winding deeper into the forest. The trees were massive here, their trunks thick and ancient, their roots twisting out of the ground like gnarled fingers. Some had hollowed out sections at their bases, big enough to crouch inside. I'd always been fascinated by trees like that. It made me wonder what animals had taken shelter in them over the years, what secrets the forest might be hiding. That's when I saw it. A giant, dead tree, standing alone in a small clearing. It was different from the others. Its bark was dark, almost blackened, and a massive hollow gaped near its base, big enough for a person to crawl into. Something about it made me pause. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The hollow was pitch black inside, and a faint, musty smell drifted out. It smelled like rot, but not fresh rot, something old, something forgotten. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it inside. At first, I saw nothing but damp wood and dirt. Then something caught my eye. A bundle of fabric, tucked deep within the hollow. My heart kicked up a beat. My brain immediately started rationalizing. Maybe someone had used it as a hiding place. Maybe it was just trash, left behind by a careless camper. But something about the way it was shoved inside, hidden, made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, crouching down to get a better look. The fabric was stiff, weathered, and as I reached in to pull it out, something heavy shifted inside. The skull tumbled out first. I barely had time to react before it hit the ground with a dull, hollow thud. A human skull. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The world around me seemed to tilt, my vision narrowing on the yellowed bone at my feet. Empty sockets stared up at me. The jaw was missing, but there was no mistaking what it was. I stumbled back, my hand trembling as I swung the flashlight deeper into the hollow. More bones. A lot more. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering in my ears. The silence of the forest pressed in, thick and heavy. Suddenly, the trees didn't feel comforting anymore. They felt like walls trapping me. Someone had put these bones here. Someone had hidden them. I spun around, scanning the trees. Was someone watching me right now? I listened, really listened, but all I heard was my own ragged breathing. No birds, no rustling leaves. Nothing. The stillness was suffocating. I had to get out of there. I pulled out my phone, my hands still shaking. No service. Of course. I looked back at the hollow tree, my mind racing. Should I take something as proof? A bone. The fabric. Every part of me screamed that I needed to get away. Now. But some stubborn part of my brain told me I had to bring something back, something to show the police. I forced myself to reach down, grabbing the fabric bundle with both hands. It was heavier than I expected, and as I lifted it, something metal clinked inside. I hesitated, then unwrapped it. A knife. Old, rusted, the handle wrapped in what looked like leather. There were dark stains on the blade, but I didn't let myself think about what they might be. I shoved the knife into my bag, then turned and ran. The forest that had felt peaceful just hours ago now felt endless, suffocating. Every shadow felt like a person. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. I followed the trail as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me. But I didn't. The silence was worse. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys. I forced myself to take deep breaths, my head pounding with adrenaline. I didn't look back at the trail. I didn't want to see if someone was standing there. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. The officer on duty listened as I tried to explain what I'd found, my words tumbling over each other. I pulled the knife from my bag and placed it on the desk. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up with gloved hands. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I told him everything. The tree, the bones, the feeling of being watched. He nodded, then picked up his radio. "We'll send someone out." I thought that would be it. I thought I'd done my part. But then he looked back at me, his face unreadable. "You said the bones were inside the tree?" "Yeah. And they looked old?" I nodded. The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. He flipped through it before stopping on a page and turning it toward me. It was a missing persons report. The photo was grainy, but I recognized the man's face immediately. He had been missing for 12 years. The next day, the police went out to investigate. They found the bones, just like I said, but there was something I didn't expect. The tree had been disturbed. The hole was deeper, the soil freshly moved. As if someone had been there recently. As if someone had been watching me. They never found out who put the bones there. They never found out who the knife belonged to. But sometimes, I still dream about that tree. And when I wake up, I swear I can still smell the rot. Camping in the Smoky Mountains had always been on my bucket list. Dense forests, rolling mist over the hills, and miles of unspoiled wilderness. It was the perfect escape. I had been on plenty of hiking and camping trips before, but this one was different. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away, a quick break from our daily lives. Instead, it became something none of us would ever forget. There were 4 of us, me, Mark, Daniel, and Chris. We had planned this trip for weeks, carefully choosing a remote campsite based on coordinates we found in an old online forum. The location was supposed to be pristine, far from the usual campgrounds, untouched by crowds, and with a perfect view of the valley below. We left early on a Friday morning, packed light, and hiked deep into the backcountry. The trail was steep and winding, cutting through dense forest. Birds called from the treetops, and the distant sound of rushing water echoed through the trees. It felt like we were stepping into another world, far from civilization. But somewhere along the way, we must have made a wrong turn. By the time we reached what we thought was our campsite, something felt off. The clearing was there, just as the map had shown, but the landscape didn't match the pictures we had seen online. The trees here were different, older, twisted, with thick vines hanging low. The ground was uneven, scattered with strange, weathered stones, half buried in the dirt. "We definitely took a wrong turn," Daniel muttered, pulling out his GPS. He frowned. "I don't have service. Anybody else?" No one did. We were too deep in the forest. Mark shrugged. "Looks good enough to me. We're not hiking all the way back just to find a different spot." Chris hesitated, glancing around. "It just feels weird." "It's fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll set up camp, stay the night, and if it still feels off in the morning, we'll head back." We unpacked our gear, set up our tents, and got a fire going as the sun dipped below the trees. The temperature dropped quickly, and soon the forest was bathed in a dim, eerie twilight. The wind moved through the branches, making the trees creak and groan. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just the occasional rustling in the underbrush, which wasn't unusual. Small animals were always moving around at night. But as the hours passed, the sounds became more deliberate. Twigs snapped in rhythmic intervals. Leaves crunched in patterns, circling us. I locked eyes with Mark across the fire. He heard it too. "Could be deer," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We listened for a while, the fire crackling between us. But the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they grew closer. Then, just after midnight, we heard the voice. It was faint, distant. A woman's voice calling out, "Help!" The 4 of us froze. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air, but none of us moved. Chris was the first to break the silence. "Did you hear that?" We all nodded. "Maybe someone's lost," Daniel said, grabbing his flashlight. Mark and I exchanged glances. There was something wrong about the voice. It was too soft, too strained. "We should check it out," Chris said, already standing. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said quickly. Mark agreed. "If someone's really lost, they'll keep calling out. If we go looking for them now, we could get lost too." Daniel hesitated. "But what if they need help?" We listened, straining to hear. The woods had gone completely silent. No insects. No wind. Nothing. Then the voice again. Closer. Help. It sent a chill down my spine. Mark swallowed. It sounds exactly the same as before. He was right. The same tone, the same weakness in the voice. Like a recording playing on loop. That was when I knew. This wasn't a lost hiker. Chris, still holding his flashlight, aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trunks and twisted branches. He hesitated, then turned the light off. "We stay here," I said firmly. "No one leaves the campsite." No one argued. The voice didn't call out again, but the sounds returned. The rustling, the snapping branches. They continued for hours, surrounding us, moving closer, then retreating. None of us slept. We sat by the fire, gripping our knives and hatchets, watching the darkness. The forest felt alive, like something was breathing just beyond our sight. By dawn, the noises had stopped. The moment the first light touched the treetops, the woods seemed normal again, almost like nothing had happened. But as we packed up to leave, Chris suddenly stiffened. "Wait, where's my knife?" We turned, scanning the campsite. His knife had been right next to him all night, but now it was gone. Then we noticed something else. The stones, those old, half-buried ones, had been moved. They now formed a perfect circle around our fire pit. None of us had touched them. We left without a word, hiking back faster than we ever had before. We never figured out where we had camped that night. When we checked the GPS later, the coordinates led to a blank space on the map. No trails, no clearings, nothing. It was as if that place didn't exist. None of us ever went back. I had been planning the canoe trip for months. A solo journey through the Adirondacks, just me, the river, and the quiet of the wilderness. It was exactly what I needed, a break from everything. No phone, no emails, no noise. Just the sound of the paddle dipping into the water, the rustling trees, the occasional call of a loon in the distance. I had done trips like this before, though never completely alone. This time, I wanted the solitude. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it, that I didn't need anyone else out here. I had my gear, tent, food, water filtration system, maps, compass. Everything I needed to stay safe. The first day was perfect. The water was calm, the sky clear, the air crisp with early autumn coolness. The leaves were just beginning to turn, their reds and oranges reflecting off the water in shimmering patches. I paddled for hours, my arms working in a steady rhythm. No schedule, no destination beyond the vague plan to follow the river north and make camp somewhere along the shore when I felt like stopping. By mid-afternoon, I found a small, rocky bank that looked like a good place to set up. It was flat enough for my tent, close enough to the water for convenience, but far enough from the trees to avoid falling branches in the night. I pulled my canoe ashore, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. The whole process took less than an hour. Afterward, I made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat on a fallen log, watching the river darken as the sun sank behind the trees. That first night, I slept deeply. The exhaustion from paddling had drained me, and the steady sound of the water lapping at the shore was soothing. Nothing disturbed me. No strange noises, no rustling in the trees beyond the occasional breeze. When I woke up, the sky was still streaked with pink, the air damp and cool. I packed up quickly, eager to get back on the water. The second day was much like the first. Long stretches of quiet paddling, the occasional pause to watch a heron lift from the shallows or to let the current carry me as I drank from my canteen. By afternoon, I had covered a good distance. The river widened, the banks growing steeper, lined with jagged rocks and dense forest. It was here, in this more remote stretch, that I noticed the first strange thing. I had stopped paddling for a moment, letting the canoe drift as I adjusted my grip on the oar. That's when I saw the ripples. They were small at first, just subtle rings in the water about 20 feet ahead of me. I figured it was a fish or maybe a turtle surfacing. But as I watched, the ripples continued, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. They weren't random like the splash of a fish or the lazy drift of a floating branch. They were steady, moving toward me. I tightened my grip on the paddle, my stomach tensing. It was probably nothing. Maybe a beaver swimming beneath the surface, its movements sending small waves outward. But something about the way it moved unsettled me. I decided to keep going. I dipped the paddle back into the water, steering the canoe to the side, trying to avoid the ripples. But as I moved, so did they, always staying the same distance ahead of me. I told myself I was imagining it. The water plays tricks sometimes. I had read about it before, how currents and temperature shifts can create patterns that look unnatural. Still, I paddled harder, wanting to put distance between myself and whatever was making those ripples. They followed. Not fast, not aggressively. Just keeping pace. By late afternoon, I was on edge. The ripples had disappeared for a while, and I told myself I had been overreacting. But the feeling of unease lingered. I needed to find a campsite soon, somewhere safe, somewhere where I could put up a fire and get some distance from the water. That's when I saw the clearing. It was a small, flat patch of land just off a bend in the river, bordered by a dense wall of trees. A good spot, elevated enough that I wouldn't have to worry about flooding, close enough to the water that I could keep my canoe within reach. I pulled ashore, dragged my canoe onto the rocky bank, and set up my tent. By the time the fire was going, the sun had dipped below the treeline, turning the sky a dull gray. I ate quickly, my eyes flicking toward the river more often than I liked. It was too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds were there, the chirping of insects, the occasional rustle in the trees, but the river itself seemed still. Too still. Then the ripples came back. I saw them just past the light of the fire, moving in slow, steady circles. Closer this time. I stared, frozen. I had no reason to be afraid. I was on land, my fire burning bright, my canoe secured. But something in my gut told me to stay alert. And then I saw it. A hand, just beneath the surface. Pale, motionless, fingers barely visible through the dark water. I jumped to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. The fire crackled beside me, casting flickering shadows across the ground. I stepped closer to the shore, my heart hammering. But when I looked again, it was gone. The ripples were still there, spreading outward, but the hand, if I had even seen it, had vanished. I backed away from the shore, forcing myself to breathe. I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. The human brain is wired to see patterns, to find familiar shapes in the unfamiliar. It had to be a trick of the water, of the light. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle, every creak of the trees had me jerking awake. More than once, I swore I heard the sound of water moving. Soft, deliberate, like someone wading through the shallows. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I could handle discomfort, but this was something else. Something deeper. I didn't belong here. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my canoe with clumsy hands. I pushed off, the boat rocking as I paddled hard, wanting to put distance between myself and that campsite. The river was calm. Too calm. I paddled faster. And then the ripples came back. Right next to my canoe. I glanced down, dread curling in my stomach. The water was dark, reflecting the overcast sky. But beneath the surface, just for a second, I saw it again. The hand, rising, fingers stretching toward me. I didn't scream. I didn't look twice. I just paddled, harder than I ever had in my life. My arms burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't slow down until I reached a wider stretch of river, where I knew there were campsites with other people. When I finally pulled ashore, shaking, I looked back at the water. It was still, empty, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never, ever come back.